On the night of 3rd November 1907, at the corner of Madison Avenue and East 36th Street in Manhattan, the bronze doors of J.P. Morgan's private library were locked from the inside. In the East Room, beneath a painted ceiling and rows of leather bindings, a 70-year-old banker wiped his spectacles on a folded handkerchief while 40 trust company presidents argued over ledgers spread across a long table. Outside, New York was in panic. Inside, the only sounds were low voices, the scratch of pens, and the muted click of a desk lamp chain. Contemporary accounts agree that Morgan literally kept the men in the building until they signed a rescue agreement, turning his library into an improvised command post for the American financial system. In the official histories, the night ends in stability and confidence. In the room, it ended with exhausted signatures, a single set of keys, and a silence that his heirs would never really own. In 1881, when other Gilded Age magnates were building new palaces on Fifth Avenue, John Pierpont Morgan quietly bought an existing Italianate brownstone on the northeast corner of Madison Avenue and East 36th Street, in the still respectable but less fashionable Murray Hill district of Manhattan. The deed records list the seller as part of the Phelps-Stokes Dodge mercantile clan. The new owner kept the house's outward respectability and began altering its interior for business and collecting. That address, 219 Madison Avenue, would become the domestic cover for a much more unusual structure built just behind it. The purchase itself was unremarkable in an era when men of Morgan's standing routinely acquired multiple properties. What set this transaction apart was its restraint. While William Vanderbilt was erecting a French chateau at Fifth Avenue and 51st Street, and Andrew Carnegie would soon build his mansion at 91st Street, Morgan chose a neighborhood that was solid but not showy, convenient to his office on Wall Street but not ostentatious. The brownstone had good bones, 4 stories, high ceilings, proper proportions, but it announced nothing. From the street, it looked like a successful merchant's home, not a financial titan's headquarters. By the late 1880s, letters and catalogs show Morgan buying medieval manuscripts, incunabula, and autographs, treating the brownstone study as a private vault for what one later article called his bookman's paradise. His 4 children, Louisa, Jack, Juliet, and Anne, grew up with the idea that their father's real attention lived not in the family drawing room, but in the locked rooms lined with shelves. The house, already deep with rugs, tapestries, and paintings, became a front for something more austere, a system for arranging knowledge and deciding who could touch it. Family letters from the period reveal a household divided between public and private spaces. The children knew which rooms were theirs and which belonged to their father's work. They learned early that certain doors didn't open for them, that certain shelves were off limits, that their father's collecting had a seriousness that transcended mere hobby. Visitors to the brownstone remarked on the quiet, the sense that even in a family home there were zones of exclusion. The early purchase records and family reminiscences show a pattern: domestic life on the avenue, serious business and collecting in the back rooms. The split seems mild at first, a banker's workroom, a father's hobby, but the foundation is already there. A house that looks like any other from the street, and an interior where even his children know some doors don't open for them. Even in 1881, the mansion was already learning how to withhold. By January 1900, property on East 36th Street behind the brownstone came up for sale after the death of Melissa Dodge. Morgan moved fast, buying a 75-foot deep plot on East 36th Street and then more parcels over the next 2 years, quietly assembling almost 2/3 of the block. Real estate guides and building notices from 1903 describe demolition crews raising old brownstones at 35 and 37 East 36th Street to clear space, ostensibly for a gallery or library, exact plans undisclosed. The land acquisition was methodical. Each purchase was handled through different attorneys, each deed recorded separately, so that neighbors and speculators wouldn't realize a single buyer was consolidating the entire mid-block. By 1902, Morgan controlled a plot that ran nearly 200 feet deep from Madison Avenue, creating a compound that was invisible from the street but vast in scope. The brownstone at 219 remained the public face. Behind it, an empire of space was taking shape. In 1902, Morgan hired architect Charles Fallon McKim of McKim, Mead and White to design a separate palazzo-like library, set back from the street and built of pinkish Tennessee marble. McKim's correspondence shows early schemes for a Greek temple facade and a more monumental frontage. Morgan rejected both and insisted on something majestic in appearance, yet intimate in scale, a jewel box hidden behind the old brownstone. On the far eastern edge of the lot, McKim's firm also designed a 6-story limestone house at 33 East 36th Street for Morgan's daughter Louisa and her husband, Herbert Satterley, linked to the family through tunnels. The architect understood what his client wanted, not display, but control. The marble would be Tennessee pink, not white, warmer, more private. The proportions would be classical but compressed, powerful without being overwhelming. Most importantly, the building would be set back from the avenue, shielded by the brownstone, accessible only to those who knew it was there. It would function as a vault, a study, and a fortress all at once. Construction began in April 1903. Newspaper coverage noted the cost, about $1.2 million, but few could see the interior. Workers were explicitly instructed not to talk to the press, and most photographs date from after Morgan's death. When the library opened for his private use in November 1906, it was already operating like an information vault. Bronze doors, heavy grill work, a garden wall toward Madison Avenue, layers of marble, and a clear architectural message that this was not a house, but a controlled environment. Inside, the rooms were designed for permanence. The East Room ceiling, painted by H. Siddons Mowbray with allegorical figures representing art, philosophy, and religion, suggested a temple of learning. The West Room, Morgan's private study, featured a massive stone mantelpiece imported from a 16th-century Italian palace. Every detail, the thickness of the walls, the placement of the windows, the locking mechanisms on the bronze gates, reinforced the same principle. What entered this building would stay, and who entered would be chosen. The brownstone on the corner continued to carry the family nameplate. The real power, financial and symbolic, shifted a few steps east into a building no one could enter without an invitation. The legend was simple: a family home on the avenue, a jewel box library behind it. The reality was a fortress for paper and decisions. In December 1905, as construction crews were still moving books into the new library, Morgan hired Belle DaCosta Green, then a young librarian from Princeton, as his personal cataloger and buyer. Born Belle Marion Greener in Washington, D.C. in 1879, she was the daughter of Richard Theodore Greener, the first black graduate of Harvard. By the time she entered Morgan's world, she had dropped the Greener, adopted the more European DaCosta, and was presenting herself as a woman of Portuguese background, a cover identity designed to survive within New York's rigid racial codes. Her father had been a prominent civil rights advocate, a scholar, and a diplomat. To work in the world she wanted to enter, the world of rare books, wealthy collectors, and elite institutions, Belle Marion Greener had to become Belle DaCosta Green. The transformation required more than a name change. It required rewriting her family history, distancing herself from her father's legacy, and maintaining a fiction every single day of her professional life. Archival letters and press profiles from the 1910s describe Green as brilliant, imperious, and indispensable. "My Miss Green," as Morgan called her in his notes. She negotiated purchases in London and Paris, often carrying authorization to spend tens of thousands of dollars in a single sale, and she developed the classification and research systems that gave the library its internal logic. At the same time, her personal life became deliberately opaque. Before her death in 1950, Green burned her diaries and most of her private correspondence. Curators today reconstruct her story from surviving professional letters and press clippings, aware that she chose not to leave a full record. What survives shows a woman of extraordinary competence. She could assess a manuscript's provenance at a glance, spot a forgery in an auction catalog, and negotiate with European dealers who routinely tried to overcharge American buyers. She spoke fluent French and Italian, read Latin and medieval scripts, and had the kind of visual memory that allowed her to recall the exact shelf location of thousands of volumes. Morgan trusted her judgment completely. and she used that trust to build one of the greatest rare book collections in the world. In the Madison Avenue mansion, Green's role was both domestic and strategic. She supervised cataloging in rooms that were still technically part of a family residence, yet she answered directly to Morgan, not to his children. She controlled what he saw, what he bought, and crucially, which scholars ever handled those volumes. Her authority in the library was absolute. Morgan's children might live in the brownstone, but Green ruled the marble building behind it. The paradox was stark. A woman who lived under an assumed identity was put in charge of the one place in the house where every name, every provenance had to be absolutely correct. She verified authenticity for a living while maintaining a daily deception about her own origins. The library's cataloging system, which she developed, was a marvel of precision and transparency. Her own life was the opposite, carefully obscured, strategically edited, designed to survive scrutiny by never inviting it. By the early 1900s, Morgan was not only a collector, but one of the central organizers of American capital, having played a key role in creating the U.S. Steel and restructuring major railroads. In the absence of a central bank, political leaders and bankers alike treated his firm, and increasingly his library, as an unofficial control room for crises. The same rooms that housed illuminated manuscripts and Renaissance bindings would soon host all-night negotiations over the stability of the national banking system. The library's dual function was already becoming clear. By day, it was a scholar's paradise where Morgan himself would spend hours examining new acquisitions or showing prized manuscripts to visitors he deemed worthy. By night, especially during periods of financial instability, it became something else. A secure, private space where the men who controlled American finance could meet without the scrutiny of the press or public. The marble walls that protected medieval manuscripts also protected financial secrets. The world outside saw a private art gallery. Washington and Wall Street saw something closer to a secure operations center, and Morgan himself seemed to understand both functions perfectly. He collected beauty and wielded power from the same rooms, using the prestige of one to reinforce the leverage of the other. On the evening of 2nd November 1907, 2 weeks into the Panic of 1907, the library at Madison and 36th was lit well past midnight. Reports from the Federal Reserve's historical branches and the Morgan Library's own exhibition texts agree on the outline. Morgan summoned dozens of bank and trust presidents to his library, divided them between the east and west rooms, and at a certain point ordered the building's front doors locked. The panic had started in mid-October when the Knickerbocker Trust Company failed, triggering runs on other trust companies and banks across the city. By early November, the entire financial system was on the edge of collapse. There was no Federal Reserve, no central bank to inject liquidity or coordinate a response. There was only Morgan and the men he could persuade or coerce into action. As ledgers and balance sheets were laid across tables between bindings of Cicero and Dante, the financial structure of the United States was redrafted in a room designed for quiet reading. Journalist accounts describe Morgan's physical tactics as much as his financial ones. One Boston-fed educational pamphlet notes that he browbeat reluctant trust company presidents throughout an all-night bargaining session in the library, refusing to unlock the doors until they agreed to supply funds to failing institutions. The mechanics were brutal in their simplicity. Morgan and his team had calculated how much money was needed to stabilize the failing trust companies. They had identified which institutions had the reserves to contribute. Now, in the library, they forced those institutions to commit. The trust presidents argued, negotiated, and resisted. Morgan waited for them out. Around 4:45 in the morning, exhausted and recognizing they had no choice, the men signed. Outside, depositors queued at bank doors. Inside, the scene was almost domestic. Coffee was poured, papers were rearranged, signatures were collected under the painted ceiling McKim had designed to celebrate humanist learning. The following day's headlines praised averted disaster, but the process left a different mark. A private room, reachable through a family hallway, had been used to conscript institutions, steer trusts, and decide who would be saved. One participant later recalled the feeling of the locked doors, not quite imprisonment, but not quite a choice either. Morgan had turned hospitality into leverage, using the intimacy of his library to create a pressure that no boardroom or bank lobby could match. The men who signed that night left with a new understanding. In a crisis, power lived not in public institutions, but in private rooms, and the man with the key decided who got out and on what terms. From that night on, the library was not just where Morgan kept his treasures. It was where other powerful men learned that closed doors could force their hands. The marble building had proven itself as more than a repository. It was an instrument. On 31st of March 1913, J.P. Morgan died in Rome. His will, filed in New York a few weeks later, revealed an estate of roughly $128 million, with an estimated 3/4 of its value in art and books. Contemporary newspaper reports highlighted the cash bequests, about $3 million to each child and $1 million to his widow. But the documents governing the library were more unusual. The numbers surprised even those who thought they understood Morgan's wealth. John D. Rockefeller, upon hearing the estate's total, reportedly remarked, "And to think he wasn't even a rich man." For Rockefeller, whose fortune approached $1 billion, $128 million was modest. But the distribution mattered more than the sum. Morgan left the disposition of his vast art and book collection to his son John Pierpont Jack Morgan, Jr., with a written request that the objects be permanently available for the instruction and pleasure of the American people. Practically, this meant that the core of the collection and the marble building that contained it would not be divided among his children like other household property. It would instead be shaped into a separate entity, governed not by family consensus, but by trustees and curators. The language was careful, but firm. Morgan wasn't mandating a public institution. He was expressing a wish and trusting his son to execute it. But the wish carried weight. Jack inherited not just a collection, but a responsibility, and the will made clear that this responsibility superseded simple ownership. The library wasn't meant to be sold, divided, or absorbed into the family's other assets. It was meant to endure. In the short term, Jack struggled with this inheritance. Lawmakers in Albany granted him a temporary exemption from import duties so he could bring his father's European-held art to New York, but he ultimately sold much of the overseas material to pay estate taxes and cash bequests. What he did not sell were the items already installed in the Madison Avenue Library. Those pieces, the manuscripts, the incunabula, the bindings, the drawings, were already part of a system that transcended individual ownership. The will turned a private room into a problem, a priceless, indivisible asset that belonged to the estate in theory, but could never be comfortably reduced to shares among the 4 Morgan children. Louisa, Juliet, and Anne received their cash inheritances and went on with their lives. Jack inherited a building full of objects that couldn't be divided, a staff that answered to the collection rather than to him, and a father's wish that felt more like a command. Money could be divided. The library, by design, could not. That indivisibility was a form of power and a form of exclusion. The other children knew it, even if they didn't say it. The library was Jack's burden, and eventually it would belong to no one in the family at all. In 1914, while estate lawyers and tax officials finished valuing the collection, eventually appraised at about $7.5 million, Jack allowed the entire library to be displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the only time the full collection has ever been publicly shown. For several months, manuscripts, drawings, and rare books that had lived in the shadowed East Room were arrayed in glass cases uptown, accompanied by wall labels explaining their provenance. The exhibition was a spectacle and a revelation. New Yorkers who had heard rumors of Morgan's collection could finally see it. Illuminated Gospels, Shakespeare folios, letters from George Washington and Napoleon, drawings by Rembrandt and Dürer. The newspapers called it the greatest private collection in America, perhaps the world. Scholars cataloged it, critics praised it, and the public lined up to view it. But the exhibition also served a practical purpose. It established, beyond any doubt, that this collection had cultural significance beyond the family. By putting it on public view, Jack was beginning the process of transforming it from private property into a public asset. The display was a kind of performance, showing the world what his father had accumulated and preparing the ground for what would come next. When the import duty exemption expired in April 1915, Jack sold substantial parts of his father's foreign holdings rather than bring them into the United States, preferring liquidity to permanent custodianship of every object. But he kept the Madison Avenue Library intact. He continued to employ Belle DaCosta Green, who now served as librarian, not just for the collection, but for a son still ambivalent about his father's artistic legacy. Green's position became more complex in this period. She had worked for J.P. Morgan, a man who understood and shared her passion for rare books and manuscripts. Now she worked for Jack, who appreciated the collection, but didn't live inside it the way his father had. Her authority remained absolute within the library, but she was managing a transition from the elder Morgan's private kingdom to something that would eventually have to answer to public expectations. For the Morgan children and their spouses, the marble building remained physically close, connected to Louisa's house by tunnels, standing a few doors from Jack's renovated residence at 231 Madison Avenue, but increasingly distant in governance. The will's language and Jack's decisions were turning it into something that belonged less to the family than to a future institution. Family members could still visit, could still walk through the rooms, but they were beginning to feel like guests in a place that bore their name but no longer answered their wishes. In museum records, these years look like a transition to public service. In a family, they might have felt like watching an inheritance walk down the block and into someone else's office. The brownstone on Madison still held family gatherings, but the library behind it was already slipping away, entering a liminal state between private property and public trust. In March 1924, 11 years after his father's death, Jack Morgan announced that he would transfer the library building and core collection to a newly created nonprofit entity, the Pierpont Morgan Library. Endowed with $1.5 million, legal documents placed control of the building and its holdings in a board of trustees, with Green as librarian and de facto operational chief. This was the pivotal act that completed what the will had started. Deeds and trust instruments show the land under 219 Madison Avenue and the library building itself transferred out of the family's personal portfolio. The trust was empowered to buy and sell objects, move the library if necessary, and manage access under the long-term condition that the collection be preserved as a distinct entity, not merged into another institution. A 1932 New Yorker profile described it bluntly. The trust owns and regulates the Morgan Library and may never merge the library with any other. The legal structure was precise. The Board of Trustees would govern the institution in perpetuity. They could hire and fire directors, approve acquisitions and deaccessions, set visiting policies, and manage the endowment. They could not, however, sell the library to another institution, break up the collection, or fundamentally alter its mission. The Morgan Library would exist as a distinct entity, separate from the Metropolitan Museum, separate from the New York Public Library, separate from any other cultural institution that might want to absorb it. From the beginning, public did not mean open doors. Early policies allowed only 10 scholars in the building at once, and access was limited to those with serious research purposes. Jack himself defended the restrictions with a line that has been preserved, slightly varied, in multiple sources. One soiled thumb could undo the work of 900 years. The statement revealed everything about the library's philosophy. Public access was a duty, but preservation was paramount. The collection existed for the American people, but the American people could only touch it under strict supervision. It was a paradox that would define the institution for the next century. Simultaneously generous and withholding, open and guarded, a gift with conditions. In the charter, the library was a gift to the American people. In practice, it was a tightly controlled research facility, governed by trustees and specialists, not by the descendants of the man whose name it bore. The keys were still on Madison Avenue, but by 1924, they no longer hung in a family hallway. They sat in the hands of a board. For Jack, the transfer must have felt like both relief and loss. He had fulfilled his father's wish, transformed a private collection into a public institution, and freed himself from the burden of deciding what to do with thousands of irreplaceable objects. But he had also given away something that could never be reclaimed. The library was no longer his, and it would never be his children's. It belonged to the trust, to the public, to history, but not to the family anymore. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, visitor logs and policy statements show a deliberately narrow door. The Pierpont Morgan Library was not a lending library, and not even a fully public reading room. Researchers applied in advance, appointments were made, and staff monitored every page turn. A mid-century analysis of manuscript use noted that institutions like the Morgan granted only controlled use of manuscripts and sometimes exclusive permissions to particular scholars for limited periods. The application process itself was a filter. Scholars had to demonstrate legitimate research purposes, provide references, and often submit detailed descriptions of their projects before being granted access. Graduate students working on dissertations might wait months for approval. Independent researchers without university affiliations often found their applications denied. The library made no apology for these restrictions. Preservation required control, and control required selectivity. Inside the McKim building, the atmosphere remained domestic in scale. Small rooms, low voices, carefully adjusted light. Manuscripts were retrieved from climate-controlled vaults, placed on reading tables with foam supports, and handled under the watchful eyes of staff members who could spot improper page-turning from across the room. Pencils only, no pens, no ink that might stain a page from the 14th century. Cameras were forbidden until the 1980s. Every interaction with the collection was mediated, supervised, documented. Outside, Madison Avenue's zoning was changing from residential to commercial. By 1925, Jack himself admitted that the family's stretch of the avenue was being engulfed by offices and shops. The physical houses that anchored the Morgan presence would gradually be sold off. The Marble Library stayed, already insulated by its new status. The neighborhood transformed around it, banks, office towers, showrooms. But the library remained a pocket of controlled quiet, its marble walls and bronze gates holding the city at a distance. For scholars lucky enough to be admitted, the rules were strict and the experience unforgettable. Later essays on the library recalled the sense that one was entering a place that still felt private, a house, not a museum. The tension between the Trust's mandate to serve instruction and pleasure and its instinct to preserve by limiting touch defined daily operations. Green presided over this system with absolute authority. She decided which scholars gained access and which were turned away. She determined which objects would be shown and which would remain in storage. She built relationships with dealers and collectors worldwide, acquiring new materials that expanded the collection while maintaining its character. Under her direction, the library became one of the world's premier research institutions for medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. But it remained, fundamentally, a place where access was a privilege, not a right. The door was not exactly closed. It was simply opened in such a way that casual visitors, and increasingly the family upstairs, could feel like outsiders in a house with their own name on the lintel. The Morgan name was everywhere, on the letterhead, on the entrance gates, in the press coverage. But the Morgans themselves had no more claim to the collection than any other citizen, less perhaps because they couldn't even claim the scholar's right to apply for access based on research need. By the 1930s, Belle de Costa Green was one of the most powerful librarians in America, known in the press for her taste, her negotiating skills, and her presence at major auctions. In 1924, she had been formally named the first director of the Pierpont Morgan Library, making her not only the guardian of the collection, but the chief interpreter of J.P. Morgan's cultural legacy. Her professional reputation was extraordinary. Dealers in London and Paris knew that when Green entered an auction room, prices would rise. She had an eye for quality that few could match, and Morgan money, first the elder Morgans, then the institutions, to back her judgments. She acquired the Lindau Gospels, one of the finest Carolingian manuscripts in existence. She bought letters, drawings, and early printed books that filled gaps in the collection and established new areas of strength. She made the Morgan Library into a destination for scholars from around the world. Behind that public role lay a private fracture that recent exhibitions and scholarship have emphasized. Green had chosen, early, to pass as white in order to escape the racial boundaries that would have barred a black woman from the professional world she entered. She rewrote her family story, distancing herself from a father who had been a prominent civil rights advocate. A 2024 museum exhibition and several reviews described the emotional toll of this perpetual cover, pointing to surviving documents that hint at strain and to the tragic suicide of a nephew whose fiancée discovered his African-American heritage. The cost of passing was constant vigilance. Every conversation, every social interaction, every biographical detail shared with colleagues or dealers had to be carefully managed. Green never married, never had children, never built the kind of intimate personal life that might have exposed her secret. She cultivated an image of exotic cosmopolitanism, Portuguese ancestry, European sophistication that explained her appearance and deflected questions about her American family background. Near the end of her life, Green burned her personal papers. Curators today are explicit about what that means. Much of what we might want to know about how she felt, how she reconciled her public authority and private concealment, is unknowable. The director of the Morgan Library chose to leave an archival silence around herself, even as she meticulously documented every acquisition and provenance in the city institution's files. The paradox defined her entire career. She authenticated manuscripts for a living, verified provenances, exposed forgeries and misattributions. Her professional life was built on establishing truth. Her personal life was built on concealment. She demanded documentary evidence for every object that entered the collection while ensuring that her own biography would never withstand the same scrutiny. Within the Madison Avenue complex, Green's authority often outweighed that of any Morgan heir when it came to cataloging, conservation, and access. Her professional legend was secure. Her personal one was deliberately erased. When she retired in 1948, the board honored her with a lavish tribute. When she died in 1950, obituaries celebrated her contributions to American cultural life. None mentioned Richard Theodore Greener or the choice his daughter had made to erase him from her story. The library preserved almost everything except the inner life of the woman who ran it. That absence is part of the cost written into its walls. By the 1950s, the Morgan Library was edging toward a more conventional museum role. Annual reports and press coverage describe concerts, lectures, and small exhibitions in the annex completed in 1928 at the corner of Madison and 36th. Fundraising campaigns in 1959 to 1962 financed an expansion that connected the main McKim building to the annex by a cloister, added a gallery and lecture hall, and extended visiting hours from 3 to 6 days a week with free admission. The expansion represented a subtle but significant shift in mission. The library was still primarily a research institution, but it was also becoming a cultural destination. Exhibitions brought in visitors who would never qualify for reading room access. Concerts in the newly renovated spaces introduced the building to music lovers who had no interest in medieval manuscripts. The institution was learning to balance its dual mandates, preservation and access, scholarship and public engagement. Still, access to the core collection remained tightly controlled, with manuscripts stored in vaults and used only in supervised reading rooms. A later National Endowment for the Humanities feature described the place as a Museum of Morgan, where the reading room admits up to 10 qualified scholars at a time, under carefully filtered light. The internal atmosphere, quiet, regulated, almost monastic, persisted even as more visitors walked through the doors. The expansion also required money, and money required donors. The Trust's original $1.5 million endowment had grown through careful investment, but it wasn't enough to support the institution's ambitions. The library began reaching out to foundations, cultivating individual donors, and applying for grants. Each new source of funding brought new stakeholders, new expectations, new voices in the conversation about what the library should be and do. Family presence, meanwhile, continued to fade. The brownstone at 231 Madison Avenue, once Jack Morgan's residence, was sold to the United Lutheran Church in 1943, and would eventually be reacquired by the library only as an institutional property, not as a family home. In 1981, for the first time, the presidency of the institution passed to someone not descended from J.P. Morgan. The symbolic significance of that transition was profound. For 68 years, the library had been governed by Morgan descendants, first Jack, then his son Henry Sturgis Morgan, then Henry's cousin. They had maintained the family connection even as the institution became increasingly professionalized and public. But in 1981, when Charles Pierce Jr. became president, that thread was finally cut. The Morgan Library was no longer, in any meaningful sense, a Morgan institution. The library was no longer a room behind a house. It was the house, and the family now entered it, if they visited at all, through the same doors as everyone else. The operation was nearly complete. The mansion had been converted into a memory system whose logic answered to trustees, curators, and conservators, not to the bloodlines on the portraits. Descendants of J.P. Morgan still existed, of course. They lived in New York, in Connecticut, in other cities. Some were involved in finance, continuing the family tradition. But their relationship to the library was purely historical. They had no governance role, no special access, no authority over the collection that bore their ancestors' name. They were, in the most literal sense, outsiders, members of the public with a famous surname, but no claim to the institution their great-grandfather had built. In 1988, the Morgan Library purchased 231 Madison Avenue, the former home of J.P. Morgan Jr., from the Lutheran Church, reabsorbing a piece of family real estate that had been outside its control for decades. The purchase was part of a broader plan to expand gallery and program space by linking all three major buildings on the site: the McKim Library, 1906, the 1928 Annex, and the 19th century brownstone. The building that came back to the Morgan was no longer a home. The Lutheran Church had used it for offices and meeting rooms, subdividing the grand spaces, installing drop ceilings, and covering hardwood floors with linoleum. The library's restoration architects found layers of institutional adaptation obscuring the original domestic architecture. They peeled away decades of modifications, revealing fireplaces, moldings, and room configurations that the younger Morgan would have recognized. By 1991, a glass conservatory designed by Vorsanger and Mills connected these structures, turning what had been separate houses into a continuous museum campus. The most dramatic transformation came with Renzo Piano's 2006 expansion, which introduced a steel and glass central court, new galleries, and a modern reading room entrance while preserving the McKim building's landmarked exterior and interior. Piano's design was both reverential and bold. The central court, rising 3 stories and topped with a glass ceiling, became the new heart of the complex, a light-filled space that connected the historic buildings while announcing that this was a 21st century institution, not a Gilded Age relic. The court housed a restaurant, a gift shop, and circulation desks, transforming the visitor experience from something hushed and exclusive to something more welcoming and accessible. Architectural critics noted the symbolic shift. Spaces that were once private, bedrooms, parlors, dining rooms, became bookstore, cafe, administrative offices. The marble library that had always been profoundly private in function became the museum's showpiece, carefully staged for tours and photo essays. Yet the research core stayed guarded. Even travel writers in 2025 remind visitors that while anyone can buy a $25 ticket to view the rooms, access to the active reading rooms remains restricted to registered scholars. The transformation was complete. J.P. Morgan's study, where he had met with trust presidents in 1907, was now a museum gallery where tourists took selfies. The East Room, where Belle de Costa Green had cataloged manuscripts, was a designated landmark where visitors were asked not to touch the furniture. The tunnels that once connected Louise's house to the library were service corridors for staff moving between buildings. In physical terms, the Heirs mansion was now fully absorbed into the institution their ancestor created, not as a home, but as another facade and a donor-named dining room. The family house had become a lobby, gallery, and shop. The library had become the permanent tenant, and the Morgans themselves, when they appeared, were guests. The expansion also represented a fundamental shift in the institution's relationship to the public. By 2010, the Morgan was attracting more than 200,000 visitors annually, far more than the handful of scholars who had been admitted in the 1920s. School groups toured the building, guided by educators who explained the significance of the collections. Families visited on weekends, drawn by exhibitions of children's book illustrations or concerts in the court. The library had become a museum in the fullest sense, balancing scholarship with public programming, preservation with access, tradition with innovation. Yet the tension remained. The reading rooms were still exclusive. The most fragile manuscripts were still kept in climate-controlled vaults, viewable only by appointment. The library still said no more often than it said yes to requests for access. It had opened its doors wider than ever before, but it had not abandoned the principle that had guided it from the beginning. Some things are too valuable to be freely handled, and preservation sometimes requires saying no. In 2024, the Morgan Library and Museum marked the 100th anniversary of its formal existence as a public institution. Fundraising. Materials and financial filings show a campaign to raise $50 million, with $35 million for endowment and $15 million for capital improvements. A major gift from heiress Catherine Rayner endowed the director's position through 2049. Annual reports note around 250,000 in-person visitors a year and millions more accessing digital collections. At the same time, the institution mounted Belle de Costa Green, a librarian's legacy, an exhibition explicitly confronting the racial passing, personal sacrifice, and ethical complexity at the heart of its own origin story. Curatorial essays and reviews in major newspapers emphasized that Green's choice to pass was shaped by a hostile society, but that it required ongoing deception and contributed to painful family consequences. Rather than conceal this history, Morgan placed it at the center of its centennial narrative. The exhibition was unflinching. It presented documents showing Belle Marion Greener's transformation into Belle de Costa Green. It displayed photographs of Richard Theodore Greener and explained his significance in American history. It acknowledged the cost of passing, the family relationship severed, the personal history erased, the constant vigilance required to maintain the fiction. And it asked visitors to grapple with the question, what does it mean to celebrate an institution built in part on concealment? Other commentaries on the centennial focus on access. The tension between the library's role as a research repository, with limited supervised access to fragile manuscripts, and its public face as a museum that must welcome visitors, school groups, and tourists. One 2024 opinion piece in a museum journal calls access unusual here, noting that much of the collection is never on permanent display, and that the reading rooms remain fundamentally selective by design. The digital collections offered one answer to this tension. By 2024, thousands of manuscripts, letters, and drawings had been digitized and made freely available online. Scholars in Tokyo or Buenos Aires could examine items that once required an appointment at Madison Avenue. Students could zoom in on details invisible to the naked eye. The democratization of access was real and significant, but it was also incomplete. Digital images couldn't replace the experience of handling a medieval manuscript, feeling the weight of the vellum, seeing how the ink had aged. The library's core function, providing serious scholars with access to original materials, remained as selective as ever. The reading rooms admitted the same small number of researchers they had in the 1920s. The difference was that now, the library had to justify those restrictions to a public that expected cultural institutions to be fully open. The cumulative message is self-aware. The institution that once locked out almost everyone now lets thousands walk its halls, but it continues to guard what can be seen, touched, and photographed. The centennial didn't unlock every door. It simply put the locks themselves under the spotlight. On a winter afternoon in late 2025, a visitor enters the McKim building from the new glass court at 225 Madison Avenue. Phones rise as people photograph the vaulted ceiling, the bronze grills, the crowded shelves. Audio guides recount how, in 1966, the building was designated a National Historic Landmark, and how its interior and exterior became protected even as the surrounding neighborhood shifted to offices and high-rise apartments. The tour groups moved through in waves, docents explaining the history in practiced phrases. This was J.P. Morgan's private study. Here, he kept his most treasured manuscripts. Belle de Costa Green sat at that desk, cataloging acquisitions and corresponding with dealers. The rooms are beautiful, perfectly preserved, staged for maximum impact. They tell a story of wealth, taste, and cultural ambition. Behind another set of doors, not on the standard tour, a reading room admits a small number of registered scholars. A staff member checks IDs, retrieves boxes, and watches over quiet desks where original manuscripts lie open under carefully filtered light. Policies and infrastructure have changed: digital imaging, climate control, loan agreements. But the basic logic is recognizable from Jack Morgan's day: preservation through selective touch, access granted not by surname but by application. A doctoral student from Columbia examines a 15th century book of Hours, making notes for a dissertation chapter on devotional iconography. An independent scholar photographs pages from a collection of medieval charters working on a study of land tenure in Normandy. A curator from the British Library inspects a manuscript on loan for an upcoming exhibition. Each has applied weeks or months in advance, submitted credentials, explained their research purposes. Each knows they are among the privileged few granted direct access to materials that millions see only in digital reproduction. Outside, the Morgan name lives on in a global financial firm, in philanthropic white papers about family legacy, and in YouTube titles that call this place the library that locked out his heirs. Inside, the legal record is more precise. The elder Morgan's will, Jack's trust papers, and a century of board minutes show a deliberate choice to convert private family capital into a controlled, semi-public cultural asset, one that would outlast both the children who once played in the Madison Avenue house and the woman who made herself into someone else to run it. The institution has evolved far beyond what J.P. Morgan likely imagined when he locked those trust company presidents in his library in 1907. It welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, operates a restaurant and gift shop, hosts concerts and lectures, and maintains a robust social media presence. It is a modern museum in every sense, responsive to contemporary expectations about access, transparency, and public engagement. But it has never abandoned the principle that animated it from the beginning, that some things are too valuable to be casually handled, that preservation sometimes requires restriction, that not everyone can touch everything. The library's generosity and its withholding are two sides of the same commitment: to keep these objects safe for future generations, even if that means limiting who can see them now. As the building closes for the night, a guard turns off the lights in the glass court, locks the outer doors, and checks the bronze gates to the old library one last time. In the East Room, a single reading lamp above an empty table stays on, casting a small circle of light on polished wood and leather spines, while traffic hums along Madison Avenue outside. The story began with a locked room that could decide the fate of banks and heirs. It ends with the same room, still locked, holding something quieter and harder to divide. Who gets to remember and on what terms?